In the annals of history, Nero is depicted as the epitome of depravity, moral decay, and despotic rule. His name became synonymous with a villain capable of the most monstrous crimes, from matricide and the execution of his pregnant wife, to poisoning his own brother and setting fire to the eternal city, for which he cynically blamed the innocent. All these atrocities, it seemed, were committed for the sake of retaining power and satisfying an inordinate ego. Yet, the most terrifying aspect of this figure was his sincere conviction that all these deeds were done in the name of art. So who was Nero truly? A narcissistic monster, a mad tyrant, or an inevitable product of an empire that had lost control of itself? Was he a victim of his upbringing, a child raised in the shadow of an authoritarian and manipulative mother? Or a young man whose soul was torn between his love for art and the burden of power? A ruler who forced thousands of subjects to applaud his talentless performances, while sending others to the arena to be torn apart by wild beasts. And yet, in the final moments of his life, cornered by betrayal, trembling before inevitable death, he did not dwell on wars, political intrigues, or even the fate of the empire. His thoughts were consumed by art. "What an artist dies in me!" he exclaimed, before ending his life with a dagger. These words, uttered in his dying agony, seemed to seal his image as a mad genius whose name forever remains in history as a symbol of boundless power and a tragic obsession with art. Nero, a figure shrouded in the darkness of contradictions, still sparks heated debate. Was he a genius ahead of his time, or a tyrant whose atrocities had no justification? Did he try to ennoble the world with his art, or merely use it to cloak his cruelty and madness? Modern historians strive to unravel the mystery of a personality that left an indelible mark on the history of the Roman Empire. Even before Nero's ascension, the Roman Empire was a complex mechanism of power where aristocratic clans engaged in intrigues, formed alliances, and eliminated rivals through poison, betrayal, and incest. Belonging to a noble family was not so much a privilege as a heavy burden, for anyone born near the throne knew that only one of two paths awaited them, either to rule or to be destroyed. Nero was not born an emperor. He was made one, transformed into an instrument of power. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, sister of the mad Caligula and niece of Emperor Claudius, was an ambitious, calculating, and ruthless woman. She not only survived in a world dominated by cruel men, but also skillfully manipulated them for her own benefit. Her main goal was to place her son on the throne at any cost, and she relentlessly pursued this objective. Agrippina married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, and persuaded him to adopt Nero, thereby eliminating the legitimate heir, Britannicus. This was not a spontaneous impulse, but a carefully planned strategic move. Agrippina left nothing to chance. She controlled all aspects of court life, political alliances, financial flows, and even Nero's education. One of his tutors was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, whom she recalled from exile to instruct her son. Nero was taught rhetoric, music, and poetry, but the most important lesson was the art of manipulation and eliminating enemies, the key to survival in the cruel world of Roman politics. Enemies fell, and Rome prepared for a new era. On the fateful day of Claudius's demise, when the emperor, according to ominous rumors, fell victim to poison mushrooms at Agrippina's instigation, Nero was barely 16 years old. The Eternal City, exhausted by the turmoil and upheaval that followed Caligula's mad reign, submissively accepted the young ruler, seeing in him a hope for stability. However, Nero was not the true ruler. The reins of power were firmly held by his mother, Agrippina. She became the de facto empress, her influence extending to all spheres of life. Her likeness was minted on coins. She processed in solemn ceremonies, and her voice was heard in the most important state decisions. In the eyes of the people, She appeared as a caring mother, but behind the scenes of powerful Rome, she was a puppeteer, skillfully manipulating an inexperienced teenager, accustomed to obedience, yet destined to one day break free from her control. Beneath the mask of submission, an insatiable desire grew in the young emperor's soul, to be recognized, to be loved, to be free from the will of others. And when this ambition clashed with boundless power, Rome transformed into a vast stage where a tragedy unfolded, and everyone around became mere puppets in his hands. Rome had a new emperor, but in reality, he was merely a youth surrounded by masks and intrigues. Behind the throne stood a powerful mother, weaving webs of conspiracy. Behind his speeches was the wise Seneca, who skillfully composed the words Nero diligently memorized. But behind the young ruler's superficial smile, a bottomless chasm grew, foreshadowing future upheavals. Initially, Nero seemed a worthy ruler. He eased the tax burden, limited the number of executions, and arranged lavish spectacles for the people's entertainment. Under the careful guidance of Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, he appeared a model of moderation and judiciousness. However, behind this outward facade lay another, deeper and more personal need. Nero did not seek power for its own sake. His true desire was adoration, but not as an emperor, rather as one would revere an outstanding artist. While senators eagerly debated state reforms, his thoughts were entirely consumed by the stage. He was passionately keen on music, poetry, and theater, dreaming of the day he could sing, perform, and bathe in the ovations of the entire empire. But an insurmountable obstacle stood in the way of this dream. Emperors do not sing or perform on stage. It was not fitting for them to play the lyre, like some provincial jester. It was this contradiction that gave rise to a deep inner conflict. In his stepbrother Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate heir, Nero saw an unpleasant reflection of his own inadequacy. Britannicus, possessing true nobility, charisma, and the legitimacy Nero lacked, aroused undisguised envy in him. But most of all, Nero was annoyed by the contempt Britannicus openly displayed. He persistently called him Domitius, reminding him of his true name and origin, emphasizing that he was not a true Caesar. Britannicus mocked his manners, his voice, his passion for art, humiliating him before senators, soldiers, and even his own mother. This Nero could not forgive. During a solemn imperial feast, held in a hall full of noble guests, Nero offered Britannicus a cup of wine as a brotherly toast. The unsuspecting Britannicus drank the offered beverage and suddenly collapsed, his body convulsing in agony. Servants rushed to his aid in a panic, and cries of horror rang through the hall. Some guests chose to pretend nothing had happened. Nero, maintaining his composure, merely remarked that Britannicus had probably suffered an epileptic fit. In the annals of history, a dark page recounts the deeds of young Nero, whose ascent to power was marked by a cold-blooded atrocity. At the tender age of 17, he ruthlessly eliminated Britannicus, his political rival, like a skilled surgeon, without flinching a single muscle. This act became an ominous premonition, the first in a series of poisonings intended to clear his path to the heights of power. The murder of Britannicus went beyond an ordinary family feud, transforming into a sinister symbol of a new era. Nero, as if casting off a puppet's mask, declared his readiness to dictate the rules of a game in which no one could feel safe. This bloody episode was a harbinger of future upheavals, the first loud crack in the fragile edifice of power Nero had built. However, the true cataclysm was yet to come, and its name was Agrippina. For many years, Agrippina, Nero's powerful and ambitious mother, held the reins of power, controlling every aspect of his life, from his ascension to the throne and image formation to the making of key decisions, and even the choice of his wife. However, by eliminating Britannicus, Nero unequivocally made it clear that he no longer intended to remain an obedient child in her hands. Agrippina, accustomed to unquestioning obedience, could not reconcile herself to this change. She did not back down. On the contrary, she intensified the pressure on her son, using all available means. She delivered denunciatory speeches in the Senate, interfered in judicial processes, and publicly scorned Poppaea, the emperor's mistress. One day, she even dared to remind him, in the presence of witnesses, that he owed his rise solely to her. These words, like poison, corroded Nero's soul, which was weary of constant control, disappointed and humiliated. Hatred for his mother flared in his heart, a poisoned blend of resentment and fear. He longed for freedom, but to achieve it, he had to commit the unthinkable, to raise a hand against the person closest to him. The story of Agrippina is a tale of maternal love betrayed by her son, and of an indomitable will to live in the face of unimaginable trials. Nero, blinded by a lust for power and driven by fear, repeatedly attempted his mother's life, but Agrippina, like a phoenix, rose from the ashes of each attempt. The first wave of atrocities was aimed at poisoning. Nero, like a shadow, crept up on his mother's life, trying 3 times to send her to the other world with poison. But Agrippina, as if sensing ill, heeded an oracle's warning, which foretold her death by her son's hand. She began taking poison in microdoses to build immunity, preparing for the inevitable struggle for survival. Then Nero, like a mad architect, decided to exploit the cunning of engineering. He ordered a false ceiling to be built above her bed, designed to collapse, like divine retribution, during her sleep. But fate, it seemed, protected Agrippina. The mechanism malfunctioned, only individual panels collapsed, and she once again escaped death. Disgraced and enraged by the failure, Nero, as if possessed, conceived a new, even more sophisticated trap, this time on the open sea. During a cruise in the Bay of Naples, the vessel carrying Agrippina, by the villain's design, was supposed to be shipwrecked. Several servants perished in the depths, but Agrippina, like a sea nymph, swam to shore. Wounded, soaked to the bone, but alive, she returned to her home, like a ghost who had escaped the embrace of death. Nero, like a cornered beast, panicked. He understood that his atrocities could no longer be hidden. If Agrippina spoke out, accused him of attempts on her life, if the Senate heeded her words, his throne would shake beneath him. And so, he gave his final, irrevocable order. That same night, a group of armed-to-the-teeth men, loyal members of Nero's personal guard, stormed Agrippina's house. She met them with a gaze full of contempt. According to legend, she, without flinching, tore open her tunic, pointed to her stomach, and bitterly exclaimed, "Strike here, where I bore this monster!" And right there, on the spot, her life ended under a barrage of knives. Nero, clad in the emperor's mantle, committed a monstrous act, staining his hands with his own mother's blood. He cynically justified his atrocity, accusing Agrippina of plotting his assassination. Hypocritical applause rang through the Senate hall, drowned out by the heavy silence of those who understood the full depravity of what had occurred. On that tragic day, Rome trembled, realizing that no one now held sway over Nero, not even the one who had given him life. By eliminating his mother, Nero for the first time felt the full extent of his power, but instead of long for peace, an all-consuming emptiness corroded his soul. He desperately tried to fill it with the only thing he thought mattered, love, or at least its pale imitation. Nero's first marriage, to Claudia Octavia, his stepsister and Claudius's legitimate daughter, was dictated solely by political necessity. In the eyes of the people, she was an ideal wife, virtuous, modest, and devoted. However, Nero felt only aversion towards her. He despised her for her primness, her inability to bear children, and the respect she commanded from the Romans. He did not love her, merely tolerated her, until the fatal Poppaea Sabina appeared on the horizon. Nero, consumed by passion, made Poppaea his mistress and soon lost his head over this affair. Poppaea became pregnant, which served as a convenient pretext for banishing Octavia, the emperor's lawful wife, from the palace. This step caused a wave of popular anger, as Octavia enjoyed universal affection. The streets of Rome filled with protesters, Poppaea's statues were destroyed, and slogans in support of the lawful empress rang out from the crowd. Nero, feeling shame and pressure from all sides, resorted to a radical solution. He sent Octavia a message, demanding she voluntarily end her life, otherwise threatening to kill her himself. Octavia had no choice but to comply. She was decapitated, her life ending at the age of just 20. Soon, Nero married Poppaea, but this union, which seemed the pinnacle of his aspirations, turned into tragedy. Poppaea became pregnant again, but during a fierce quarrel, Nero, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, delivered a crushing kick to her abdomen. Poppaea fell, and bleeding began. Her screams filled the palace, but death proved relentless. The unborn child perished with her. It is rumored that after Poppaea's death, Nero lost his mind. He wept as never before, buried her with imperial honors, but could not banish her image from his heart. Unable to cope with guilt, he desperately tried to find a replacement. One day, in the palace, his eyes fell upon a young slave named Sporus. The striking resemblance to Poppaea was undeniable. The same eyes, the same face, the same elusive aura. Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated, dressed him in his deceased wife's clothes, gave him a new name, and presented him in public, holding his hand at feasts, and addressing him as if he were the living Poppaea. This was no longer love, but madness, grief that had turned into a morbid delusion. Nero's madness reached the point where political influence gave way to emotional control, making him an unpredictable and extremely dangerous figure. The summer heat enveloped the streets of Rome, as if foreshadowing an impending catastrophe. The city slumbered, unaware of the approaching disaster. On July 18, 64 AD, flames broke free in the vicinity of the Circus Maximus. A minor spark, caught by a gust of wind, became the beginning of a destructive fire that engulfed Rome. For 6 days, the inferno mercilessly destroyed the roofs of buildings, majestic columns, sacred temples, and claimed the lives of citizens. 2/3 of the city turned into a lifeless desert, covered in ash. Thousands perished in the flames, and hundreds of thousands lost their homes and livelihoods. At this time, Nero was away from Rome, enjoying leisure at his villa in Antium. At least, so the official version goes. Some claim that, upon receiving news of the fire, the emperor immediately returned to the city to provide aid to the victims. He allegedly organized rescue teams, supplied people with food and temporary shelter, and even opened his private gardens to those who had lost everything. However, there is another, much darker version of events. It is rumored that Nero not only knew about the impending fire, but himself ordered its organization. They say that, standing on the terrace of his palace in theatrical costume, he played the lyre, admiring how the flames illuminated the night city. In the fire, he saw not tragedy, but a work of art, a captivating spectacle, a source of inspiration. Is this an exaggeration, malicious slander, or a bitter truth that not everyone is ready to accept? Soon after the tragic fire that engulfed Rome, Emperor Nero began the construction of the Domus Aurea, a grandiose palace complex that rose from the ashes of the fire-destroyed city quarters. This palace astonished the imagination. Wine fountains, ivory elephants, halls sparkling with gold and precious stones, and even an artificial lake, all testifying to boundless imperial whim. The enraged residents of Rome, whose homes and lives had been destroyed by the fire, began to suspect that Nero himself had engineered the disaster to clear space for his new, luxurious palace, which became a symbol of his inordinate ego. Rumors multiplied, and with them, popular indignation grew. Sensing that his position was becoming increasingly precarious, Nero realized the need to find a scapegoat onto whom the blame for what had happened could be placed. Nero's choice fell on the Christians. The smoke had not yet cleared over the ruins of Rome when the emperor pointed to them, declaring them the culprits of the fire. No trial was held, no thorough investigation conducted. Nero simply needed someone to blame. Christians, already disliked by many Romans due to their alien religion, their rejection of the empire's gods, and their secret gatherings, became the ideal target. In an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, others are always perceived as a threat. In antiquity, when the Roman Empire extended in all its might, Christians were subjected to horrifying persecutions. They were crucified on crosses, like criminals devoid of all humanity, and thrown to hungry dogs, becoming silent victims of a cruel sport. Living people were turned into flaming torches to illuminate the imperial gardens at night, and Nero, like a mad artist, used their bodies as canvases for his sinister art. He organized circus shows where Christians became the main entertainment for the bloodthirsty crowd. Pain transformed into spectacle, and death into entertainment, all under the jubilant shouts of the public. Nero did not hide his atrocities. On the contrary, he was proud of them, laughed at the suffering of the innocent, and applauded each new execution. However, even among Roman citizens, accustomed to cruelty and violence, feelings of discomfort and disgust began to emerge. It was not compassion for the victims, but the realization that excessive cruelty had crossed all acceptable bounds, that made them feel a vague unease. Tacitus, one of the few Roman historians who dared to write about these events, noted that even the enemies of Christians began to feel pity for them, seeing their innocent suffering. But Nero was relentless. He continued his insane struggle with his own guilt, and each new victim became a desperate attempt to drown it in blood. He seemed to strive to silence the voice of conscience, turning the lives of others into ashes. In his youth, Nero dreamt of becoming an artist, not an emperor. While other boys played at war and politics, he found solace in music, poetry, and Greek tragedies. The sound of the lyre moved his heart more deeply than the speeches of senators. His cherished dream was not to command armies, but to captivate audiences with his voice, gestures, and acting prowess. However, fate had other plans, transforming him into a cruel tyrant whose name would forever remain in history as a symbol of madness and bloodlust. Yet, his ascent to power profoundly altered his nature. The young man who had dreamt of the limelight and public acclaim gradually came to believe that the world was merely a stage for his personal triumph, and every inhabitant was obliged to be an audience member for his grand performance. Over time, he developed an addiction to applause, not that born of genuine admiration, but that prompted by fear and subservience. He began to stage lavish spectacles where he himself performed as the sole star, and thousands of subjects, senators, and soldiers were compelled to attend, regardless of fatigue, illness, or reluctance. Theater doors were firmly locked, preventing anyone from leaving before the performance concluded. And no one, absolutely no one, dared to stop applauding. Legend has it that once, during one of his interminable performances, a woman gave birth directly in the stands, yet she was not permitted to leave the venue. Others, utterly exhausted, feigned unconsciousness merely to escape the torment. Some went to extreme lengths, choosing to throw themselves from the upper tiers of the amphitheater rather than endure another hour of his morbid craving for adulation. But Nero continued to sing, descending deeper into the abyss of madness. He imagined himself a new Orpheus, an immortal poet, a genius misunderstood by the masses. Yet, before him was not a grateful audience, but merely a terrorized populace, deprived of freedom, and forced to feign delight to avoid brutal retribution. History records episodes when Emperor Nero, surrounded by a retinue of thousands of young men, embarked on a journey through Greece. Their sole task was to applaud him incessantly, regardless of the artistic merit of his performances. This was not a manifestation of love for beauty, but rather a display of power, cleverly veiled under the guise of talent. Fear, disguised as false applause, was the true motive behind the events. In the final years of his reign, as the Roman Empire declined, its generals betrayed him, and the Senate plotted against him, Nero continued to declaim theatrical monologues. He stubbornly played his part, as if reality were merely a flawed play that he could rewrite at will. When the end finally came, and he realized his isolation, finding no support from the army or political allies, he turned to art. He met death as he had lived, playing a tragic role. Choosing to evade justice, he opted for suicide, uttering before it the phrase that would forever be etched in history: "What an artist the world loses in me!" In that moment, he appeared not as an omnipotent emperor, but rather as a disillusioned child, a broken soul who never truly grasped that genuine art springs from love, not from fear and violence. The tragic end of Emperor Nero's reign was marked by the collapse of his power and universal condemnation. At the age of 30, after 13 years on the throne, he faced a harsh reality. There was no one left to protect him. The Senate, once obsequious, declared him an enemy of the state. Supposedly loyal allies plotted behind his back. The military, weary of his excessive vanity and insane antics, refused to obey him. Initially, Nero desperately clung to power, planning an escape to Egypt, dreaming of disguise and a new beginning. However, he could not conceive of an existence without the adoration of the crowd and thunderous applause. The stage was everything to him, and now it was gone. Hiding in a villa on the outskirts of Rome, surrounded by a few loyal servants, Nero likely experienced true fear for the first time in his life. The sound of approaching hooves and the cries of soldiers sent by the Senate to apprehend him heralded the end of his reign. The curtain had fallen, and there would be no encore. In a state of utter despair, Nero turned to one of his servants, asking to be shown how to take his own life. But even this final act, he could not bring himself to perform alone. He was tormented by doubt, trembling, crying, and begging his servants not to abandon him. He pleaded for someone else to take the dagger, but no one dared to carry out his wish. When the thunder of soldiers' boots grew unbearably loud, portending imminent arrest and public humiliation before execution, the emperor gathered his last vestiges of courage. With the assistance of his loyal secretary Epaphroditus, who was by his side at that fateful moment, he committed suicide, plunging a dagger into his throat. His dying words, uttered as an epitaph to himself, were imbued with tragic pathos. "What an artist the world loses in me!" Thus passed the emperor whose passion for theatrical art overshadowed affairs of state. A man who preferred false adulation to genuine respect met his end in solitude, without an audience, applause, or his former glory. Rome shed no tears. Some cursed his name, others sighed with relief, freed from the burden of tyranny. The Senate, seeking to erase him from the annals of history, issued a decree of damnatio memoriae, condemning him to complete oblivion. Yet, oblivion never truly came. Figures like Nero, who pushed their ambition, madness, and egocentrism to extreme limits, do not vanish without a trace. They transform into dark legends and cautionary tales, serving as a reminder of what an empire can become when governance is replaced by theatrical performance.